The inside of the DeSilvio mansion was not what I expected at all. The classy but bleak stone outside gave way to a very warm interior, with wooden floors covered with rugs and wood-paneled walls. I looked around and immediately felt comfortable. Mr. DeSilvio opened the doors to a room off the main foyer and led me to a quiet room lined on one side with bookcases on either side of a stone fireplace. And on the other side, light streamed through an open window and lit up the room with beautiful natural light. In the center of the room, we sat down at a small circular table, and Mr. DeSilvio asked me if I'd like something to drink, as he picked up a clear glass carafe off a nearby sideboard and poured the contents into a glass. I said I would love some water, and he poured another glass for me and placed it in my hand. As Mr. DeSilvio turned and placed the water back on the sideboard, I looked around the room and remarked how quaint the room was. There were a few old-fashioned-looking portraits hanging on the walls, and despite its older decor, it still had a lively, vibrant feel. Mr. DeSilvio and I both sat down in our chairs, and I asked him if he wouldn't mind my recording our conversation for my reference. He smiled and said, "That would be fine," and we began to talk. I asked him about what had first brought him to this part of the country, and his answers were clear and concise. As we talked, I realized that for a man older than myself, he was charming and engaging, and his words seemed very well chosen. I noticed that his left ring finger was bare, and so I was about to begin asking him some questions about his personal life when my train of thought was completely derailed by a loud crashing noise. It seemed to come from beyond the door that was behind Mr. DeSilvio and directly opposite the door where we had entered. Mr. DeSilvio smiled and apologized. He explained that he had hired local contractors to do some renovations on the property. As he stood up, he said that he liked the men's work, but things did tend to get a little noisy every so often. I smiled and said I understood as he politely excused himself and walked through the far door behind where he had been sitting. As I sat there waiting for Mr. DeSilvio to return, I looked around the room when suddenly I heard another unexpected sound. I tilted my head to listen and thought that it sounded like a clinking noise, like metal on metal. Only it wasn't coming from the direction of the loud sound I'd heard before. As the sound continued, I tried to discern where it was coming from. I stood and walked towards the wall where it seemed to be coming from, and as I leaned against the wall, my hand brushed against a thick tapestry hanging just beside the fireplace. I leaned to one side in order to avoid disturbing the hanging fabric and braced my hand against the top of the fireplace where its stone rim raised up from the wood paneling that covered the rest of the wall. As my fingers rested against the stone and I repositioned myself to better hear the sound, my little finger on my left hand felt a strange groove in the stone near a faint symbol that had been carved into the fireplace. I looked down and rubbed my fingers along the small decoration on the stone surface and realized that the groove was almost invisible, at least to my eyes. I would never have noticed it if my finger had not randomly grazed over it. I followed the small groove with my index finger and discovered that the groove ran around a small section of stone, completely encircling it. I thought to myself, it's like a little stone button, and playfully pressed it with my finger as if it were a switch. And then almost squealed in surprise as the stone section I had pressed receded into the surrounding stone, and the entire fireplace descended about a foot into the floor with a faint mechanical sound, and then moved at least 3 feet backward into the wall. I was shocked. Did that really just happen? I asked myself as I stared at the procession of stone steps descending underneath the floor that had been revealed by the shifting of the fireplace. I stood there as if rooted to the spot for a moment. And then, much louder now, that same clinking sound came up from the darkness. I licked my lips, which for some reason suddenly felt very dry. And then, without a conscious thought on my part, my feet seemed to act by themselves, and I climbed down the stone steps into the darkness. I had thought a lot about what shoes I would wear to my interview today. I think guys are almost always surprised at how much thought girls put into things like that. Essentially, all of my outfit choices start with shoes. Early in the morning when I looked through my shoes to decide what to wear, I'd been torn between a dressy pair of shiny patent leather heels and the soft, more student-fashion flat-soled boots that every girl in America seems to own. As I descended the stone steps, I was glad that I had chosen the boots. At the bottom of the steps, I saw a corridor lined with rough brick that was lighted dimly by a set of warm lights. The clinking sound seemed to be coming from the far end of the corridor. I took a deep breath and walked down the wooden floors that were old and dusty in comparison to the fine lacquered surfaces above. I called out, "Hello?" down the corridor, and the clinking sound stopped. My feet kept walking down the corridor, which was lined on either side by open spaces. The first spaces were filled with furniture, covered with dust and the occasional cobweb. But as I continued, the next spaces were secured by gates, fastened with thick metal chains and strong-looking padlocks. The floors of these areas were strewn with traces of hay, as if horses or some other animal had been penned within the spaces. I proceeded down the hallway and saw on the right-hand side of the corridor another pen area secured with a chain. In the corner of this section was a large, black dog, laying on top of a large cushion fashioned into a bed. The animal stared at me with glittering yellow eyes, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I heard a low, soft, but menacing growl from the back of the area. I was so focused on the dog and its hostile sound that I hardly noticed the space behind me, until its occupant reached out through the bars behind me and suddenly grasped me by the arm. About 2,000 volts of terror jolted down my spine, and without thinking, I spun away and fell on my bottom onto the dusty floor. There, reaching for me through the bars of another penned area secured with a lock and chain, was a middle-aged woman. "Help me," she said in a raspy voice. "Help me!" Slowly, I stood up, bracing myself against the bars on the other side of the corridor. I heard the low growling sound again, and looking into the pen where I had last seen the dog, I could clearly see now that the animal was not growling at me, but at the woman reaching through the bars, as if he didn't trust her. Not quite knowing what to do, I finished climbing to my feet and dusted off where my clothes had touched the dusty floor with my hands. Staying out of reach of the strange woman's hands, I introduced myself by my first name and asked the woman how I could help her. My first instinct was to find a way to free her, but something odd about how she looked at me made me think better of it. She didn't seem injured or in any danger, except for the fact that she was held captive in a creepy secret passage underneath the mansion. She asked me again to help her, and I wasn't sure what to do. I said I would like to help her and asked how she had been locked up. "There's no time," she hissed at me. "There's a blood ritual being prepared, and tonight it will be too late. I must stop him." The woman had a frighteningly intense look in her eyes, and although I had sympathy for her situation, a little instinct inside me clearly did not want me to let her loose. As I stood there, I suddenly realized that I had been gone from the room where De Silvio left me for several minutes. I wasn't sure what he would do if he saw me here talking to this woman, but as I looked at the other empty areas secured with bars, I decided that it would be best if he didn't find me. I told the woman that I would be back and ran towards the stairs back up to the room with the shelves and bookcases. As I left, I could hear her hissing at me. "Look at his face if you don't believe me. See for yourself!" When I climbed up the steps and re-entered the room, I was relieved to see that there was no sign of De Silvio. The door he had used to leave was still closed, and there was no sign that the glasses on the table had been moved. I walked to my chair and sat down when another jolt of panic struck me. The fireplace! I stood and ran back over to the fireplace. The small stone button I had used before was now underneath the recess where the stone structure had receded into the wall, and I could see no obvious switch or other sort of device. I frantically searched behind the tapestry and pulled on some of the books in the bookcase, hoping to trigger some mechanism that would close the secret passage. My eyes fell upon the brass-topped iron poker in the holder beside the stairs. I grabbed the poker and pulled it in my direction, hoping that I would hear a satisfying click and see the fireplace rush back in, closing the passage. The poker fell onto the floor and left a small black smudge on the beautiful rug. Almost panicking, I dropped to my knees and put the iron poker back in the small metal rack where it had fallen from, and tried to rub the black smudge out of the carpet. I succeeded only in smearing it around on the rug, but when I looked up, I could see on the surface underneath the place where the stone fireplace had recessed, there was a small, white, circular object. I got to my feet and walked over to the side of the passage and bent over. My hair fell over my shoulder and hung behind me, But to my surprise, I could see a white button switch and a small depression carved into the wood of the wall. When I pressed it, I heard a mechanical sound as the fireplace slid forward, slowly. Over the mechanical sound, I heard voices steadily growing louder from behind the far door of the room, as if people having a conversation were approaching. I dived back towards the chair where I had been sitting at the small table, and watched the fireplace settle into its original position just as the door opened and Marion DeSilvio re-entered the room. I noticed that I was breathing heavily after my ordeal, but DeSilvio just smiled and sat down. "Sorry to keep you waiting. Now, where were we?"